All right, so today we're going to be talking about Friday the 13th from 1980. It's a movie that you've probably heard of at some point. A lot of you out there have probably seen it, but you know what? It's the day before Friday the 13th. I want to talk about this classic movie. My brother has his own podcast called The Horror Shuffle, and he talked about this movie at way more detail than I'm probably going to muster up for it. But anyway, if you want to know who I am, I sometimes write about horror movies and, you know, TV shows and also just regular movies and TV shows. And this podcast is sometimes dealing with, pop cultural stuff, but I sometimes talk about politics and have self help style topics and, all that kind of stuff. But today we're going to be talking about a slasher movie. And this is considered a seminal American slasher film that became one of the first and most iconic entries in the slasher horror genre. Although, of course, it's not the first. And I always feel funny saying seminal because, you know what that word sounds like. But anyway, this movie is something else. It's one that can grow on a person over time, even if they did not like it at first. If you've seen it more than once, it's got some things that you may have missed the first time around or the first few times around. And I suppose that's true of just about any movie, but this one there's actually a lot to explore. And it's directed by Shaughnessy Cunningham, written by Victor Miller, and released on May 9th, 1980. Of course, it's widely credited with popularizing the slasher genre, although the executioner in this movie, so to speak, is not actually one of those masked maniacs. It's actually some other type of killer. But it is still a slasher movie, part of that subgenre of horror. And the success of Friday the 13th really helped assure that slasher movies could thrive as they did during the late 20th century. And of course, I'll just do a quick plot overview here, even though a lot of you have already seen it, but maybe some of you haven't. And there are going to be spoilers here because, that's what you do when you talk about a movie that you've seen. You're probably going to reveal some details. But the story is set in Camp Crystal Lake, a summer camp with a dark past due to the drowning death of a young boy, Jason Voorhees, in 1957. So, years later, counselors attempting to reopen the camp are stalked and killed one by one by an unknown assailant. And this is after a similar incident that happened really not that long after Jason had drowned on that fateful day where some camp counselors just weren't paying attention. They were, according to at least one person, they were too busy screwing around, and it really set the ball rolling, I guess you might say, the wrecking ball that is the initial killer and the future killer of the franchise. So the film concludes with a shocking twist. Get ready for this. It's revealed that the killer is Pamela Voorhees, Jason's vengeful mother, who blames the camp counselors for neglecting her son. You know? Apparently, somehow they never did bring back the body from the lake, though, because a future movie, the sequel, brings Jason back. He's, another spoiler alert, he's back in part two, and man, is he pissed because he's continuing his mother's tradition of slashing people up. He even travels outside of his comfort zone of Camp Crystal Lake to stalk the survivor girl of this movie. And so Jason's got some ingenuity. He's he's not quite as stupid as some people would think he is. And even though he's not the most talkative bloke, it's also true that in this movie, it's very strongly implied that Jason Voorhees actually could talk because, we have this flashback scene where we see Jason drowning in an imagined sequence and he's shouting for help, uh, as he's drowning. So it's really something that strangely is omitted from a lot of conversations about the Friday the 13th franchise, that Jason can actually talk. He's not mute, and he's not so mentally damaged that he wasn't able to speak, or whatever. He didn't have a severe inability to talk normally, at least according to this film. So I guess he's just the strong silent type in all of the sequels. Anyway, the movie ends ambiguously with Jason seemingly reemerging from the lake, although it is also strongly implied that it's maybe a dream sequence. And she says, "Then he's still there, still there, still there," with the echo repeats. And that's one of the things that I'm not such a crazy fan about with this movie. It really does subtract at least a little bit from it that they didn't just end it when she's pulled into the water from that canoe. And I really think they should have ended the movie right there. And maybe they could have like shown the ripples in the water after that, and that could have been the end of the movie. They should have skipped the part where she woke up in the hospital bed and all that kind of stuff. It would have been enough of a welcome to Crystal Lake moment to not have the revelation that apparently Adrian is still alive. But then again, I suppose you wouldn't have the sequel part where Jason stalks her and takes care of business in part two. So it's a bit of a mixed bag thing. I mean, I guess it's sort of like the end of the original Nightmare on Elm Street, which a lot of people actually have a problem with. Although for me personally, I think this ending is a little bit more of a bummer than that. Even though, like the moment where Jason jumps out of the water, it is badass. There's really no taking away from that. At least not in the extreme. But the moment where she wakes up in the bed, it does sort of dull the impact of that a little bit. And, I don't want to be a whiner about it, but I guess I kind of am. So, here we are. Anyway, it's a bit of a key detail of the series too, I suppose. Like how you interpret that moment. But anyway, I went over how it's directed by Sean S. Cunningham. But I should mention that he was also a collaborator with Wes Craven on the movie The Last House on the Left, which is another thing that a lot of people don't seem to comment on that much. How, you had these two sort of iconic horror creators who were collaborating, you know, before their biggest franchises. It seems like there'd be more conversations going on about that. Not like nobody's ever talked about it before. That's not what I'm saying, but it's odd that's sort of skipped over in a lot of, commentary. But it was written by Victor Miller. The budget was approximately $550,000, and the box office gross was over 59.8 million worldwide, making it a massive commercial success. And that's why they had so many sequels and a TV series spin-off that really didn't have anything to do with the movies that much. And of course, it was also the success of this movie also just generally inspired people to keep making slasher films and horror movies generally, because that's what commercial success does. It's It's one of those things, you get copycats and you get people who try to outperform, or in this case, outshock audiences' expectations, Um, and but when it comes to a lot of horror movies, I think it's hot. It's like a hot thing for a moment in time to make these types of movies, and then they sort of die down, but then they kind of get triggered again by the success of some other horror movie. And this movie is 95 minutes. Of course, it's a horror movie, and the slasher thing is definitely strong in this movie. It's not like one of those movies that's like ashamed to be a slasher movie. It's very much a key part of it. And the cast includes Adrienne King as Alice Hardy, who is the final girl or the protagonist. You also have Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees, the antagonist. You have Kevin Bacon as Jack Burrell, who's one of the counselors. And this is Kevin Bacon in an early role. There's Harry Crosby as Bill, Laurie Bartram as Brenda, Janine Taylor as Marcy, Walt Gorney as Crazy Ralph, one of my favorite characters. And really, one of the few reasons that I'm still on Twitter is that there is a parody account of Crazy Ralph that's just downright hilarious. He posts some funny stuff. And, I know some people wouldn't want me to get political here, but, I'm barely hanging on to my Twitter account. I'm very tempted to just ditch it. But the Crazy Ralph thing is a pretty strong reason that I'm still there. And you also have Peter Brower as Steve Christie, Rex Everhart as the truck driver, and Ari Lehman as Jason, as the young boy Jason. There really is no adult Jason in this movie, though, of course, he does come back as an adult in part two, and for some reason he has, way more hair in that movie. And it's basically redneck Jason in part two. But here he's just a boy, you know, uh, deformed and presumably deceased, or maybe even ghost boy. But this movie did have a cultural impact. It's got a legacy, and thankfully, some people, they really do like the character of Mrs. Voorhees. It's not like people have completely shied away from it. They don't tend to play favorites or whatever. They hold Mrs. Voorhees in pretty high regard, and that's how I view her as well. And not that if not that I would respect her that much if she was a real person doing what she's doing. But I think most people at least understand her motivations, even though she is a loon. There's no denying that she's out there. She's a murderess, and you know, it's one of those things. So Friday the 13th, of course, helped establish many of the tropes of the slasher genre, though it didn't establish the masked killer. Jason's hockey mask appeared in later sequels, not this movie, as I'm sure most of you already know. But what the hell, I'm going to say it again anyway, just to reiterate it. The concept of the final girl is also continued in this movie. You know, uh, I should also mention that Walt Gorney, who played Crazy Ralph, he also did the opening narration of Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. And that narration goes like this: There's a legend around here, a killer buried but not dead, a curse on Crystal Lake, a death curse. Jason Voorhees' curse. They say he died as a boy, but he keeps coming back. Few have seen him and lived. Some have even tried to stop him. No one can. So that's a pretty badass narration. You know, it's a very neat part of the seventh movie. Might even be the best part of it, to be honest, even though I like part 7. But, it's that narration done by Mr. Gorney is pretty stellar. And, of course, part 7 also continues with the final girl thing. But if I should note that this, of course, didn't invent the final girl. You had that in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Alien had it. You also had Olivia Hussey, who was a final girl in Black Christmas, which was back in 1974. So those are earlier examples of the final girls. So I don't want to give this movie too much credit because it didn't really invent that. And, some people they don't like that trope anyway, but whatever, it is what it is what it is. That's an annoying expression for some people, but this is one of those moments where I think it applies. Anyway, this movie is frequently cited as an influence on subsequent slasher films like A Nightmare on Elm Street, though again, it came after some films like Halloween. So, really, the one of the big influences here is simply that it was successful. A lot of people got it into their heads that, hey, we can launch it. We can launch our own franchise after this. And this was also back when you didn't have other films with massive franchises to sort of coach you into it, to like study and see how they did it. These were like the days when horror franchises really weren't nearly as established. So it's not to say there weren't any. I guess there technically might have been at least a few, but they definitely were not as prevalent. And this film spawned a long running franchise indeed, including a bunch of sequels. I think it's 12 sequels. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. Um, let's see. No, not 12 sequels. um, I don't think so. I don't think we're quite there yet. But, anyways, there were spin offs and a 2009 remake. Jason Voorhees, though only briefly seen in the original film, as I said, he became the central figure in the series. And as the movies kept going on, he became almost more like a super soldier or something, just kicking ass around Camp Crystal Lake with a mission of just slashing people up the best that he could. And, even though some people slashed him up themselves, it's hard to outslash a slasher. And Jason is indeed one of the biggest names in that entire profession. So, what was the critical reception of this movie? Well, some critics dragged it through the mud, and it's kind of understandable. It's not exactly a masterpiece of a movie. Though, in terms of like just classiness, I would say this movie is definitely classier than some of the other Friday the 13th installments. Like, part 4 is actually pretty trashy. Like, if you've got squeamish family members, you probably wouldn't want to watch it around them because there's definitely more nudity in that movie. I don't remember there actually being nudity in this one. So even though, this movie was considered sheer trash when it came out by some critics, it's actually relatively benign in terms of that. Although, as my brother noted, they do actually kill a snake as they filmed the actual killing of a snake. So this was back when they just didn't care about that stuff. So, the initial reviews were mixed, with some critics dismissing it as exploitative or derivative. And, one critic, he was talking about exploitation, and he said, capitalism is an effect of government. The disappearance of government means that capitalism falls from its pedestal vertiginously. That which we call capitalism is not something else but a product of the state, within which the only thing that is being pushed forward is profit, good or badly acquired. And so to fight against capitalism is a pointless task, since it is state capitalism or enterprise capitalism, as long as government exists. Exploiting capital still exists. The fight, but of consciousness, is against the state. Oh, wait, that wasn't a movie critic. That was the Spanish individualist anarchist Miguel Jimenez Igualada. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But anyway, that was my attempt at a joke. Um, just randomly introducing radical politics into this because I know that my listeners will love that. But anyway, it was triggered because I used the word exploitation. So that's probably only funny to me. I don't know. But anyway, the movie garnered a cult following and later earned praise for earned praise for its suspenseful atmosphere and creative kills. You know, the special meat or the special sauce were the special effects, and in some ways the creature effects, because Jason Voorhees does look a little bit like a creature here in this movie. But the practical effects were by Tom Savini, and they were a standout feature, including the infamous arrow through the neck scene involving Kevin Bacon's character. At least I think it's an arrow. I don't remember exactly what it is, but he gets it through the neck. And regarding how realistic his kills are in films, he said, or Tom Savini said, I saw some pretty horrible stuff. I guess Vietnam was a real lesson in anatomy. So that was from an interview with The Independent, but he said similar things throughout his career. He was, I think, a Vietnam War photographer. So one of the things that helped him in his later career in special effects was just viewing dead bodies and whatnot. He got to see gore in real life, and maybe it traumatized him a little bit. But I think he had sort of a sort of a warped mind, and maybe a positive way, in that he used it to his advantage later on in his special career and special effects. You know, uh, on a personal note, I will say that my dad was also in Vietnam, and he apparently witnessed the Tet Offensive, and that kind of scrambled his circuits up a little bit. So, he was a bipolar alcoholic who would threaten to go on shooting sprees. So, not everybody spun that sort of experience in a positive way, in the way that Tom Savini did. I'm not saying my dad was a villain or something like that, but he had problems, and he sometimes presented problems. I could get into that deeper here, but I'm not going to do that at the moment. For trivia, this is some pretty well known stuff, but Betsy Palmer, who played Pamela Voorhees, initially took the role to pay for a new vehicle, expecting the film to go unnoticed. And also the eerie ma 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 stuff, that sound motif is based on the words Killer Mommy, as imagined by composer Harry Manfredini. And, what more can I say? I think I've covered a lot of ground here without being too epic in my analysis. Friday the 13th remains a cornerstone of horror cinema, at least for a lot of people. It's notable for its influence, its low budget ingenuity, and its place in the pantheon of American pop culture. Everyone has seen the Friday the 13th hockey mask around Halloween time, and maybe you've worn it yourself, maybe you've played Jason, but it's kind of fun to think about how there really wouldn't have been a Jason if it wasn't for his mom going around slashing people up. So, you know, if you're a fan of Jason, you owe you owe a debt of gratitude to this movie, because we just wouldn't have the same horror icon if his mom didn't lay down the law back in her day. So, I guess I'll dedicate this pre Friday the 13th episode to Pamela. We miss you, Pam. Come back soon.